April of 2026, New York investigators knocked on a door in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. They were closing in on a 58-year-old man suspected of the 25-year-old murder of Nancy Smith. But just days after that intense questioning, the suspect met a sudden, tragic end, leaving the case permanently closed before he could ever stand trial, leaving Nancy's family with a mystery that can now never be fully answered. Nancy Smith was 32 years old and had recently bought her first home on Provost Drive in New Windsor, New York, and had earned a master's degree in public administration. She worked at Horton Hospital in Middletown and was known as a caring aunt with a bright smile. On December 5, 2001, when Nancy failed to show up for her shift at the hospital, her parents grew worried and drove over to check on her. That's when they walked into a nightmare. On the floor of her home, they found Nancy brutally stabbed and concealed under blankets on her living room floor. When investigators arrived, they found it strange that there were no signs of forced entry, meaning she likely knew her killer and had willingly let the person inside. Over the years, multiple agencies would be involved in the case and would follow close to 1,000 leads and conduct more than 500 interviews. Unfortunately, the only solid piece of physical evidence they had was a single strand of hair recovered at the scene, and it had been tested against more than 65 different suspects with no matches. In 2023, the New Windsor Police Department resubmitted the hair for state-of-the-art DNA analysis. The new technique works differently from a straight CODIS match. Instead of comparing a suspect profile to a database of convicted offenders, investigators upload the unknown DNA profile to public genealogy databases and use distant family matches to build out a family tree, narrowing in on possible identities. The work pointed investigators to a name that had never appeared in the original 1,000 leads and had never been on the suspect list. A man living in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, named Robert Young. Sadly, the following year, in 2024, both Nancy's parents passed away within weeks of each other, never learning who murdered their daughter. In February of that same year, investigators from New Windsor and the FBI traveled to Myrtle Beach and lawfully obtained a DNA sample from him. They sent it to the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center in Albany, and it matched. When investigators dug into Young's background, they learned how he likely walked into Nancy's home without leaving signs of forced entry. That's because he was a musician who'd played in several Dutchess County bands that frequently performed at the Chance Theater, a venue Nancy was known to frequent. According to investigators, the two would have likely crossed paths there. In April of 2026, with the DNA match confirmed and the connection between Nancy and Young documented, investigators returned to Myrtle Beach to interview Young directly, and he willingly sat down with them. However, he denied any involvement in Nancy's death. So detectives flew back to New York to continue building the case for a potential arrest. But they would never get the chance because several days later, Young took his own life. On May 28, 2026, the New Windsor police confirmed that after 25 years, Nancy's murder was finally solved and publicly named Young as her killer. Since Young took his own life, no charges were filed and Nancy's case was officially closed. On the morning of June 4, 2002, 24-year-old Brandy Wilson sat down for breakfast with her husband at their rural home in Colfax, Indiana. Her husband, Kenny, had just gotten off the night shift and headed to bed shortly after. However, according to him, when he woke up around 2 p.m., Brandy was mysteriously gone, and so was the $420 in cash they kept in the home. But her purse, both of the family's vehicles, and even her wedding rings were left behind. Unfortunately, after that night, Brandy was never seen or heard from again. Brandy Nicole Wilson was born on July 12, 1977, and grew up in central Indiana. Around the time of her disappearance, She was a 24-year-old mother of 2 young children, an 8-year-old son from a previous relationship, and an infant son she shared with Kenny. According to everyone in her life, those kids were her world, which makes her disappearance that much more suspicious. She also worked the 3rd shift at the Donaldson Company plant in Frankfort, Indiana. Unfortunately, her marriage to Kenny had allegedly turned tumultuous, with coworkers reporting that she had shown up at work with bruises and a black eye on more than one occasion. She even confided in at least one coworker that Kenny had allegedly strangled her unconscious about a month before she disappeared. Allegedly, Kenny was also cheating on Brandy with a coworker of his, and Brandy had found out and confronted him. On her final shift before her disappearance, Brandy would make a very ominous statement to her coworker, telling her that if she didn't show up for work the next day, Kenny had done something to her. And just like she predicted, the following day she was a no-show, and that same night, 4 of her coworkers reported her missing. When investigators questioned Kenny, he admitted that their marriage had been struggling, but said they were trying to work on things. He even said he had sent the children to stay with their parents for a few days, so he and Brandy could spend some time together. He also continued to maintain that she was still in the home when he went to sleep that morning. Authorities initially treated the case as a voluntary disappearance, in part because there were no obvious signs of a struggle inside the home. But as the days turned into weeks, and Brandy never contacted her children, her mother, her coworkers, or her closest friends, that theory slowly fell apart. Her mother, Pam McGuire, told investigators there was no possible way her daughter would have abandoned her sons, especially the infant. And if she had left voluntarily to start a new life, why didn't she at least take her purse and vehicle? A month after Brandy vanished, investigators announced they had received a typed letter that contained what they described as legitimate leads in the case. The writer of the letter has never come forward, and the contents of it have never been publicly released. All that's known is that the person who wrote the letter claimed to have direct information regarding Brandy's exact physical whereabouts, and investigators do not believe it's a hoax. They begged the person to publicly come forward, but sadly they never did. Some believe the person who wrote the letter is the secret girlfriend Kenny had been having an affair with, but that's never been confirmed. Kenny has remained the primary suspect in the case since early on, and as detectives looked more closely at his background, they uncovered a history of serious violence. In 1987, he had been charged in connection with the murder of an elderly victim who was beaten to death and whose body was disposed of in a freezer. As part of a plea agreement, the murder charge was dropped, and Kenny pleaded guilty to robbery with serious bodily injury. He served roughly 10 years in prison before being released, after which he met and married Brandy. Despite this history and the inconsistencies in his account, no arrest has ever been made. The case sat cold for over 20 years until the Clinton County Sheriff's Office accepted help from the Cold Justice TV show, and they learned that Kenny had made some very interesting comments after Brandy disappeared. He had allegedly joked with his fellow night shift coworkers about finding a brunette in a nearby lake and warned that they'd never want to see what was in his car trunk. They, just like investigators, concluded that Kenny was the likely suspect, but the local district attorney refused to bring the case to a grand jury. If you or anyone you know has information about the disappearance of Brandy Nicole Wilson, please call the Clinton County Sheriff's Office at 765-656-8477. Brandy disappeared on June 4, 2002, and as of June 2026, her case remains unsolved. On the night of February 12, 1997, in the small town of Harmony, Indiana, a maroon 1988 Ford Escort was found burning in an alley about 100 yards behind the home of Joan Stockrahm. Inside was the body of her 21-year-old daughter, Jennifer. Police initially told Joan that Jenny had taken her own life by setting the car on fire. But an autopsy would reveal something very different and turn the case into a homicide investigation that nearly 3 decades later has never been solved. Jennifer Stockrahm, who went by Jenny, was born in March of 1975 and raised in Clay County, Indiana. She graduated from Northview High School in 1993, where she was known as an outstanding student. She was described as having a warmth that made her easy to be around and was also known for her love of children. By February of 1997, Jenny was just a few weeks shy of her 22nd birthday, living with her boyfriend, Robert Davis, in the Knightsville neighborhood not far from her mother's home. Unfortunately, their relationship had turned very tumultuous. In September of 1996, only 5 months before her death, a sheriff's deputy named Mike Heaton responded to a report that Davis had beaten Jenny up and left her stranded in the nearby town of Staunton. Jenny managed to get back to the Knightsville neighborhood and called for help from a neighbor's house. When Deputy Heaton arrived, he accompanied Jenny back to the trailer she and Davis shared so she could pick up some belongings. While he was there, he noticed parts in the trailer that matched the descriptions of vehicles reported stolen. He got Jenny out of the trailer and to a hospital and began working on getting a search warrant. Davis was charged with domestic battery, and Jenny moved into a shelter for women. After a few months, she called her mother and asked her to come pick her up. However, Joan, believing her daughter was safer at the shelter, told her to stay. By February of 1997, Jenny was back in Davis's orbit. On the night before she died, she left a message on her mother's answering machine. Her last recorded words were, "Mom, are you there? I love you." The following day, her car was found burning in the alley behind Joan's home. Investigators initially treated the scene as if Jenny had taken her own life, but the autopsy quickly put that theory to rest when pathologists found a single gunshot wound to her chest. She'd been shot before the fire was ever set, and her case was reclassified as a homicide. 2 days after Jenny's death, Davis was arrested. The charges, however, had nothing to do with her murder. Investigators charged him with 19 felony counts related to a stolen car chop shop he'd been running out of the trailer he had shared with Jenny. He was ultimately convicted on 4 counts of altering a vehicle identification number, 12 counts of receiving stolen property, and 1 count of corrupt business influence, or racketeering. He was then sentenced to 88 years in prison, plus an additional 12 years for being a habitual offender. However, he's never been charged in connection with Jenny's murder. To this day, tips still come in, and the Clay County Sheriff's Office continues to investigate her murder with the help of the Indiana State Police. If you or anyone you know has information about the murder of Jenny Stockrahm, please call the Indiana State Police, Putnamville District at 1-800-225-8576 or 1-765-653-4114. Jenny was found murdered on February 12, 1997, and as of June 2026, her case remains unsolved.